Thank you, Richard. So we're going to move into an open discussion now. So I realise that people might have specific questions about what you've heard to the speakers, but if we can try and keep quite general and focus on the kind of threats rather than the opportunities, because the opportunities is what we'll move on to in the sessions that follow. So does anybody would like to start off from the audience in a question for the panel? And if I could just remind you to use your microphones and identify yourself for those that are listening over the internet. Who'd like to start me off? Yes, Tim, please.
Several of the speakers touched on this master question of can life adapt to multiple global changes? In particular, could that delay a tipping point or, for example, and don't need to tell people in the room that could mean several things. It could mean physiological acclimation, not really adaptation, but I guess clearly in the corals case, we're seeing a system that is at the limits of physiological acclimation. But it could mean sort of species sorting. It could be that there's, in population genetics terms, there's enough variation that a different suite of available species are functioning better at, let's say, the higher temperature and can take over. And I'd love to know, actually, because we have the Baz-Becking hypothesis for microbes that everything is everywhere and the environment selects. And in soil microbial systems subjected to warming, we appear to see that prove to be the case in warming experiments, that there's a species sorting going on that changes the response. Is it when it comes back to corals, I'm kind of curious, is there a fundamental that isn't the right assumption, and that there just isn't the available diversity of species or alternatives to have a species sorting, in which case you're left with the third thing, which is you have to have novel mutation as a source of variation upon which selection can act, which again can happen quickly for microbes and sometimes quickly for eukaryotes, but not always. And I guess I just wanted to put those three types of adaptation in a loose sense out there so that we could think a bit more about which ones are at play in particular cases, because it feels like different ones might come to the rescue or not in different cases.
Well, I think you're entirely right. There's a broad spectrum of different scales of adaptation and permanence of adaptation. Microbes can change quite quickly, but they can change right back. The symbionts in corals can change. Symbionts in plants can change. The genetics of a species can change. The species in a community can change. The entire community can change. So you're entirely right. There's a broad set of responses. I think Richard was talking about species level change, for example, being really, really important. And then there's evolutionary change over long periods of time. I think what I've always been focused on is short periods of time. How do we move through the next century? Coral reefs provide food, protein in particular, for hundreds of millions of people and protect hundreds of thousands of miles of shoreline. How do we protect that ecosystem service over the next couple of centuries? That's the focus, requiring a faster response, say, than we would normally get on a geological timescale.
Yeah, and I'd like to add that certainly we're seeing a lot of plastic adaptation, so non-genetically based adaptation, change in behavior, change in habitat, change in where they live. But I would argue that to reinforce what I said, we're really seeing that where you have good habitats, where you've got fairly natural habitats, where you have healthy ecosystems, where the systems are degraded, we aren't seeing that level of adaptation. And in terms of evolutionary adaptation, we're also seeing that. But again, we're seeing, species playing around with the genetic variation they already have. We actually are not seeing novel mutations taking over. We're not seeing new climatic tolerances evolving for particular species. So I think we're already seeing the real limits of both of those kinds of adaptation.
Hi, Dove Sachs. I have a question, I guess, around the limits of adaptive capacity and where the boundaries are. And so when we heard about coral reefs, I kept wondering, I believe, and I'm not an expert, but in Earth's history, there have been times when things have been warm enough that we just didn't have any coral reefs. And so that sets sort of like a sort of boundary beyond which we might not expect any adaptation to allow them to persist. And we could imagine the same things for forests. You know, you don't have forests in the tropics if it gets too dry. And so if we want that from a carbon sequestration point of view, we could think about that as a boundary. And I just wonder if it would be productive to think about where those boundaries are and how that sets us thinking about risk. So I'll just open that question up.
If I can start on the coral side and then proceed to the forest, you're again, exactly right. There's limits to how evolution can push any population. We've seen that in agriculture. As you steadily select agricultural species, they lose the capacity to respond to selection, and then we may be facing that in the future in corals. There's a difference between coral reefs as ecosystems and corals individually as species, and so after the PETM, for example, coral reefs all but disappeared as an ecosystem, but many of the species survived in isolation here and there. But we're really focused on what it takes to make a reef, which is lots of populations of corals. Adaptation is not, I think, going to solve the problem of climate change in the future. But I do hope that we might find some ways that it could, in places where it could slow down the decay, push ecosystems away from those tipping points a little bit so that we have a little extra time than the 12 years that Chris gave us.
I'd like to reinforce that I do think of adaptation, whether it's genetic or plastic or whatever, as being something that it's very important to present to the conservation management community as one of the options, as part of the toolbox that they can use to help them preserve, whatever their patch of land is or set of species or communities. Because I agree with Tim that if we just do the doom and gloom, people give up. And I've had this happen a lot in giving talks to various groups is they're having a tendency to give up. And I think it's very important, and maybe a good product that could come out of this is that even though none of us considers either plastic or genetic adaptation to be the ultimate savior, that it could be extremely important as a local management tool. And so I would like to see that as perhaps part of the product that comes out of this.
Okay, Danielle, I think you had a question next. I'll come to you next.
To briefly follow up on the geological examples which have been used, is it the Pliocene or is it warm climates? As a geologist, I'm very nervous about these comparisons because the Pliocene, we had millions of years of ramping up to a world which was admittedly at a CO2 we have today, but was on average 3 degrees warmer. Millions of years is adaptation time, is evolutionary time scales. While, if we're using geological examples, it's profoundly important to consider the rate of change. As Steve said with the example of the Paleocene-Eocene thermal maximum, even that was 10 times slower than what we're currently experiencing, and we saw extinction. So we need to put geological examples into that, because we had very high CO2 and very high climates and lovely coral reefs and beautiful carbonate production in the Cretaceous. But it was a very different world over millions of years. The question I had is, if we are talking about local adaptation, local healthier systems, local activities people can engage in, then we need to see it as a two-sided sword. And that is, how do we define, picking up on Richard's comments, where we give up, where we would invest a lot of energy but don't get too much, and where is it worth talking about land use changes in the Great Barrier Reef, reducing fluxes of sediment loading and making these places where initiatives and work has a real effort. How do we define them, and how do we therefore enable those local initiatives to do it at the right place?
Everyone's looking at you, Richard.
My name came up, didn't it? I don't know the answer, but I will say from the whole field of vulnerability assessments, we're engaged in trying to do some science that underlies how we identify which species are most vulnerable. But even if we can get that right, then the question is, well, where do we put the money? When do we say, well, this one's so vulnerable that we should let it go and we should put our money into this one, which is less vulnerable, that we could do something about. So that's exactly what we're trying to get at, but it maybe becomes a value judgment beyond what the science can tell us. I'm not sure, but yeah, it's a good question.
Make just one quick addition to that, is that absolutely, I agree, it's going to end up being a value judgment, but I also think the public wants scientific input as well. So ultimately, the public is paying for this, and they do need to have some buy-in as to who gets saved and who doesn't. But I think when I've talked to general public who are environmentally aware but really don't know much about the science, they would like input. Is this community important in other ways? Is this species a key species for some other reason? So I think even where it is a value judgment, I think it's important that the scientists stay involved.
So I guess on top of that then is whether we've got enough information about all the different systems we might be interested in, of course, and there's challenges there for data collection. So Tim, I think you wanted to come in there?
I'm trying to find a way to think about this increased frequency of negative disturbance in a constructive way, to either ask, okay, there are some disturbance factors that are increasing that are going to be hard to control around increasing temperature variability. I also want to bring Monica in because I immediately think of fires, where there's a rich history of us trying to control that disturbance factor, and also to think that we could create deliberate, should we call them positive disturbances, whether that's deliberate reintroductions of species to a system that's just been hit. I mean, no one's pretending that's cheap or easy, but I'm just trying to think of a way we could flip that quite accurate, I think, but rather frightening narrative of increasing disturbance, increasing likelihood of bad tipping. Can we turn that around? Are there some disturbances we can control, and are there some we can introduce?
Yeah, so that's a good point. And with the fire example, there are other places where introducing fire will actually help to maintain resilience, because they're systems that were not adapted to the type of stand replacing infrequent fire that I spoke to. So I think there are cases where disturbances have been removed from a system, and reinserting them can be very helpful. In the situation that I'm talking about, I think that things like maintaining the heterogeneity in the area once it's disturbed can help us a tremendous amount with resilience. That's something that is under management control oftentimes, because from, again, a practical standpoint, sometimes people come in and they burn out all the potential fuel. Well, in many cases, you're also losing some of the propagules that might be important, or you're losing stepping stones for habitat for other organisms that you might want to sustain. So I think there are things that we can do. Taking advantage of environmental topographic heterogeneity, for example, and elevation and aspect, if you're in an area that has terrain, that can also help to buy you more time or maintain aspects of your system, because it's not like the thing about disturbances, even the big fires or the hurricanes, they do not create moonscapes. They create very heterogeneous environments, and I think we're working a lot on understanding how valuable that is for system resilience.
Yes, please.
Nancy Grimm from Arizona State University, also with the same cold. I was just going to respond to this last comment about disturbance and point out that I think, I think you identified this correctly in your remarks, that it's often not the sort of disturbances to which an ecosystem may have been exposed, but those that are new, either new in terms of frequency, severity, but in some cases, it's compounding the stressors. And so I'm thinking, for example, of the Southwest, where the introduction of exotic grasses has increased the likelihood of fires in the desert environments that are not, have not in the past been exposed to these kinds of disturbances. And so it seems that we have to think about how those events are actually taking ecosystems outside the range of what traditionally they have exposed to.
Amen. Yeah. No, it's very true. I mean, we have to think about the novel disturbances, and in the case of the like the cheatgrass coming into the desert ecosystems or the annual grasses, that's an example of one of those stabilizing feedbacks that actually, like, and you'll notice I did not say alternative stable states in my talk because I was talking about big changes that are ecologically meaningful and they may or not be persistent. And in this case, that's a case where you're setting up a new dynamic in a system that has not adapted to it. And I think we need to be considering many more of those kinds of interactions than we have to date, and recognize that the disturbance can be, even if it's a one to which the system is adapted, it can be the catalyst for change because the system has such memory or there's lags before the responses, and so that event can catalyze changes that are in response to multiple other stresses. So that multivariate consideration, I think, is just a very rich area on the research side with very practical implications.
Just to add to that, I think for many systems, there's not just one disturbance, as you were saying, and the trade-offs among them are really important to deal with. Nancy mentioned hurricanes and coral reefs. They're incredibly important in reducing coral populations and then wrecking reefs. If there's a trade-off between heat resistance and, say, growth rate and fragility, then how do you protect it against both of them? There's disease. There's multiple ways that climate affects ecosystems, and I do think it's really important to keep in mind that the maintenance over long periods of time is going to demand paying attention to many of them.
Callum, you want to come in, and then I'll come over here.
Callum Roberts, University of York. Just a general point for the panel. I'm wondering how your narrative of change and adaptation and dynamics of ecosystems under a shifting planet, it can be translated into conservation terms. And the reason that I say this is because managers of protected areas and parks and whatever don't like change. They avoid adverse change, but they don't like change into a novel configuration of an ecosystem. And so, the shift of some grasses into some area, which is seen as a very positive response, let's say, to a shifting environment. If you're thinking about ecosystems continuing to work, is seen as a negative, and people try to hold these things back. So how should we try and shift the kind of practice of nature conservation so it's going to be more dynamic too?
I guess I'll take that one on. I mean, this is something I've been talking about for 10 years, so it's very, and to a lot of conservation management audiences as well as public audiences. And I think it's one of the most important things we can do is to get people to understand change is coming, has come already. Things have already changed, and it's not always wise to be fighting back against it, depending on what the driver is. And I find that audiences have a hard time with this, but that conservation managers have really shifted over the last 15 years as they've started accepting that climate change is affecting their protected area and trying to think in terms of, not trying to keep the status quo, but trying to just help biodiversity. And I just gave a talk in London last week to a bunch of just environmentally conscious people, but who knew nothing about the science. And they were horrified when I said, look, you need to embrace change. You need to think of biodiversity, not just in your backyard, but you need to think of it regionally, continent-wide, global-wide, and think in terms of how can you help preserve biodiversity in the broad sense. And I think it's hard for people to hear and hard for them to change overnight, but if we keep pushing that, I think they are receptive once they understand that it's going to happen whether they want it to or not, and therefore they may as well help the change be as positive as it possibly can, rather than just constantly fighting against it and spending huge amounts of money and huge amounts of time and energy trying to fight something that really is inevitable. So I agree with you. It's a mind shift, And I think the only way we're going to see that happen is by keeping on harping at people that this is where we need to go. Sorry.
I'll add one more comment. The managers that I work with and interact with quite a bit, which are mostly national park and wilderness managers, they have accepted that there is likely to be change. And the two things that we don't have good answers for them is what's coming. So if the forest is changing, and so I can say, well, we'll have less forest and more grass, and the forest will be younger and it'll move up slope. But they want more concrete information to respond to, and then and we don't have good answers for that. And the other one is, what should they do? Should they change their approach to managing the fires? Should they maybe, even though they try to manage for process, how should they be making decisions about what to allow and what not? And then the third point I would make is that I always try to emphasize that we still have natural, and again, I am speaking from working in one of the largest wilderness areas in the conterminous United States. So it is one of those healthy systems, not the degraded areas, but that we may be surprised also by the capacity of the species to shift and to rearrange, and that we should still be open to that. And because there's so much interest in wildlife, the fact that there are some winners and some losers is another important point that we've had to make. But we don't have all the answers in the science that they want.
Sandra, I got Sandra, and then Chris, and then there was somebody here, and then Kathy. So Sandra, Chris, then Kathy.
So Sandra Lavrel in CNRS, Grenoble, France. Much of the points I was going to make have been covered, but I'd still like to emphasize, and also building on what Richard was saying, that much of the challenge is about understanding community reassembly. It's not only about understanding loss of multiple groups of species interacting, it's also understanding what is being built up, also in relation to new disturbance regimes, possible migration of some species and others not, etc. And so in terms of research questions, it's really one of the key aspects, community reassembly.
It sounds weak. I totally agree, absolutely. And I'd love to hear if others know better, but I don't think we've got the tools at the moment to do that. I think that's one of just the big research challenges in terms of understanding complex networks and how these systems are rearranging. To bridge that from understanding some dynamics about the system to the kind of information that Monica was just saying, that you've got community, land managers who are wanting this real concrete information, and really there's a disjunct there because the science just, I don't think, can say that very concretely at the moment. So we need, it's a big challenge.
I totally agree. I think the challenge is a little greater sometimes in marine systems than terrestrial ones, because there's such a history in terrestrial systems to doing things, planting trees, releasing butterflies, affecting the ecosystem in a way that you want it to reassemble. Purposeful reassembly of marine ecosystems is very difficult, and it's really kind of in its infancy. It's happening in terms of seagrasses and mangroves as foundation species. People are talking about it in terms of corals. People are though afraid of introducing species in an open environment that girds the whole world. So there are real debates going on about to the extent to which we should be purposefully reconstituting ecosystems in different settings.
Okay, thank you. Chris, you want to come in?
I want to ask a question about how we think about sensitivity of species or ecosystems. And I would say the paradigm of the way that natural organisms work is they have a kind of a stable behavior over some range of conditions, and then they tend to hit a threshold. And we've tended to focus a lot on organisms that we see doing things in the current realm of variability, but the unfortunate fact is that we're moving into a different range of mean conditions and variability. And I guess my real question is whether the best way to think about sensitivity is to focus on cases where we've already seen thresholds surpassed, or whether there are other kinds of approaches that might be relevant, whether they're looking at underlying physiology or genetics or an understanding of community interactions. But I guess I'm concerned that we're sort of looking under the lamppost for the keys because it's hard to figure out what the signals would look like for sensitivity that's outside the range of observed variability.
There's a reason why that's a great analogy.
It's the same problem in ecosystems.
Yeah, just as a short example of doing that, for probably 20 years after the 88 fires, we documented such recovery to those really big fires in Yellowstone, and we had also modeled the effects of climate change, and we always got resilience. And it didn't occur to us to think far enough outside the box for what the projections are now. And that completely changed the story. And I think it has also pushed us towards looking to understand the mechanisms that could produce the types of changes we anticipate might happen, because we're not going to see them play out for a very long time, just because the trees are long-lived organisms and you're dealing with infrequent events and gradual changes in drivers. So I think it's one of the reasons that we do need to do exactly what you're saying, whether it's genetics, whether it's physiology, or understanding what conditions could produce the future changes that we think could occur.
Okay, Kathy, I think you wanted to come in. You have the distinct disadvantage you're right next to the camera, so there's going to be a zoom in of...
Oh, God.
but I'm conscious of time, so we've got about 5-6 minutes left. So I'll go Kathy, and then Nathalie, and then Yavinda, and then I think we'll maybe just try and close up there, and we can continue conversations, of course, over lunch. But Kathy, sorry.
I'm Kathy Whitlock, and I've really enjoyed the discussion so far, and interested in this early warning signals and observations that there's a lack of resilience now to even small changes in climate and slowdowns in the system that Tim was mentioning. And I'm a terrestrial paleoecologist, and I'm always looking for situations where I feel like what we're seeing is unprecedented. And I know that we're going into uncharted territory going forward, but I also think that you need the paleo record to really understand variability, and it's very easy to focus on things that are very idiosyncratic or very local in scale, especially in the terrestrial realm, or short-term, or maybe not in a long-term context, and and raise the early warning flag. So anyway, I guess I'm putting in a plug for a longer perspective and maybe more use of these long-term data sets that we have to understand resilience.
Anyone want to comment on that?
Yeah, I totally agree, but there is an element here of the situation now is just so different because species aren't just responding to climate, they are in extremely fragmented landscapes with very small populations that have very different capacities to adapt. So I just think we have to be mindful of the synergies with other factors that are human-induced on the natural system, that we need to be mindful that means that the playing field today is very, very different to how it has been in the past. But yeah, sure, we need to learn from the past.
Okay, Nathalie?
Thank you very much for your stimulating discussions. We could probably talk all day on these topics. I'm sort of really encouraged to hear from you that you feel that conservation managers, so at the local level, are embracing change and these concepts of resilience. But I do worry at a higher level in terms of the international conservation organisations, the extent to which they are embracing change and these concepts of resilience. There's still a lot of conservation is very species focused and drives a lot of the conservation agendas. And I do worry, and I know others worry as well, that a lot of energy and funding is going into these individual species vulnerability assessments. And a cynic might say, well, so what if we work out who's doomed or not? You know, given the rates of species lost, as illustrated in the Living Planet report, means 60% declines on average across the planet. Most species are doomed. And so do we not at a high level in conservation and in international policy discourse need to instead be embracing change and these concepts of resilience and this idea of conserving the evolutionary potential of our landscapes and working within those multifunctional landscapes, that's where those changes need to happen, but at a high level. If they're happening at a local level, then that should change the narrative higher up, but I worry that that's not happening fast enough.
One example, I think, where it is happening very quickly is in the coral reef community. 5 to 10 years, the International Coral Reef Society was sort of aghast at the idea of replanting corals and doing broad-scale restoration and having nurseries of corals all over the world. And in a month, we're going to have an entire meeting on the future of coral reefs. It will be almost all about that. And there's been an enormous shift in just the last 8 to 10 years of managers and people that are thinking about the future in this one case, where it's now, okay, all tools are open, all hands on deck. There's a crisis. We have to think out of the box in ways that literally 5 to 10 years ago just were not considered even realistic at all.
Okay, thank you very much. Edwin, if we can just make this brief, because we're right on time now. So if there's one person in this room that was going to make sure we finish in time for food, it was me. So we'll just take this last question.
Okay, I'll try and be brief. It's a bit of a provocative one to end on, perhaps. One of the purposes of a meeting like this is to identify science priorities, what we need to understand. And there's been a few suggestions from this panel, for example, around community assembly and processes around there. But as Rich pointed out, that we're a long way from even having basic toolkits to approach that. And I wonder, and yet the systems are changing in the real world, and I wonder whether there are areas of science where the likely rate of progress of our understanding is much slower than the likely rate of change in the real system. And therefore, we shouldn't think of them as priorities for activity, because they're actually going to be observational things that we're going to just see out there, rather than a predictive science that we have enough a priori understanding to change. So are there areas that we should almost de-emphasize as science priorities because the rate of change in the real world is faster than the rate of progress of our understanding?
I think that's a great idea, and it's also a strong plug for long-term research progress.
Okay, if you'd like to join me to thank once again our speakers for their insightful thoughts. And thank you. I realise I didn't get around as many questions as we hoped. I mean, obviously the conversation doesn't stop here, and we can continue to do so over lunch. And there's a few more housekeeping announcements, but yes, thank you very much. Thank you.
All right. Thanks, everybody. That was great. So I do have two announcements to make before we have lunch. Again, if we will reconvene promptly at 1:25 for the next theme. If the facilitators from the first workshop, we're going a little bit out of order today, but the first workshop is at the end of the day. There are 4 facilitators. Let's say at 1:05, well, if you could meet here at the front of the room with the staff to run through the workshop plan. And then at about 1:15, if the second panelists could meet with their moderator here at the at the front of the room to and give up the last 10 minutes of your lunch. I don't know where we're having lunch. That'll probably be very obvious, just out here. And I would. It's about 57 degrees outside Fahrenheit, 14 C. It's not raining, so if anybody like me needs fresh air, I would think you probably should take your identification when you leave the building, so they'll let you back in. Thanks for a great morning, and I'll look forward to reconvening after lunch.